and that we needed to let it go, which we did. And then we got a letter from a neighbor. My favorite phrase in that letter is, "You may have lived like this in the South." Anyhow, the urge to clean up really is deep-seated and I think misplaced. Becky Thornton, our next speaker, no stranger to anybody here in the room, president of Dutchess Land Conservancy, where she's been for a number of years, responsible for the preservation and stewardship of 37,000 acres in Dutchess County, member of numerous land management boards, and just a real force for stewardship of the landscape in this county. So Becky, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Can everybody hear me okay? Ready. So my presentation may be a little bit of review to some of you, because I know a number of you in the audience have worked with Dutchess Land Conservancy to protect your own land. But I'm going to give a little bit of an overview. So DLC is an organization similar to others, but also different from others, and we protect a number of different resources, including farmland, wildlife habitat, our forests, scenic views, and of course our fragile water resources. And so in terms of DLC as an organization, across the state there are lots of different types of organizations. There are statewide organizations, staff, some with no staff, and our organizations have protected lots of land across New York State and nationally, actually. So there's 1,600 land trusts like DLC nationally, and they've protected over 10 million acres. So these are some of the organizations that some of you who are not in Dutchess County might be familiar with. So why do we protect land? We protect land to benefit the public, essentially. Our farmland provides us with our food, our forest land, our clean air, and our wildlife habitats, ecosystems. We're really just beginning to understand, and Cary Institute has been really awesome in helping us figure out why our ecosystems are so important to our own lives. Our water resources, our scenic views. We all use land for recreation, whether it's our own personal recreation, for some private recreation, or even getting out on our parks. Some of our landscapes are very significant historically, and then a lot of our land is important to our own communities for some reason or another. And so in terms of local protection, DLC is, this graph kind of shows that, back in 1985 when DLC was first started, land conservation was something that was just starting to become known to people. And in fact, a lot of people are actually kind of afraid of the whole concept because, partially because of, the way the government would come in and take land through eminent domain to protect it really for the public good, but people are afraid that, oh my gosh, you're coming to take my land. So it took a lot of education to get people to understand that, private land conservation is a good thing. And so you can see the trend over the last 25 years has really, that people have grabbed onto this concept and really support land conservation. DLC as an organization, we started out with 247 acres, and as Bill mentioned, since then, we've now increased our protected land to over 37,000 acres. So as an organization, we have limited tools in terms of trying to protect land. So we could purchase land, but especially in Dutchess County, land is pretty expensive, so we'd have to raise a lot of money to do that. We can also purchase conservation easements on land, or something you may have heard of purchasing development rights, and we do some of that when we can raise the funding. But a lot of our work is really by accepting donations of conservation easements from landowners who are willing to go through this process with us and who really care about their land. So what are some of the questions most come up most often. So I guess the biggest one is, if you haven't done this and don't really understand, why would a landowner want to put an easement on their property? So these are some of the reasons why, in terms of my experience, people love their land. They really care about it. They may care about their community and value its rural character. In fact, Dutchess Land Conservancy was formed by a group of landowners who didn't just care about their own property. They cared about what was going on in the community. They were afraid that zoning wasn't going to help protect this area and keep it rural. Landowners understand why their land is important. Some landowners actually want to, leave a gift to the future, leave a legacy. There was a farmer that we worked with whose he and his brother had inherited their farm from their father, and they protected it with us just a couple of years ago. And at the closing, one of the brothers came up to me and said, "My father would be so proud of what we did." And so other reasons are that, sometimes if you can buy development rights, a landowner can realize some equity from their land without actually having to sell it. And there are also some potential income tax benefits, state tax credit, so there may be some financial benefits, but those are somewhat limited, so you really have to love your land and want to protect it and to choose to do this. So what exactly is a conservation easement? So an easement is a legal agreement between an organization like the Dutchess Land Conservancy and a landowner that essentially spells out what you can and can't do on a property. The landowner still owns the property. They can still do mostly what they would normally do on the land, and it does not allow public access unless the landowner specifically wants to choose to do so. And the easement under state law can only be given to a qualified organization like Dutchess Land Conservancy or to a government agency, but often a government agency really isn't set up to oversee that easement into the future. What's the difference between an easement and deed restriction? Some people may know there's a lot of private deed restrictions where landowners get together and agree that they're not going to do things. The big difference is that if a deed restriction can be removed by mutual consent of the parties to that deed restriction. And so I know I was talking to one landowner about a property that they owned, and they sold the neighboring property and they put a deed restriction on it. And the deed restriction said, nobody can ever build in the field because it's in my view shed. Well, the next buyer came in and they started building a house right in the view shed of this landowner, and when he found out how much it was going to cost him to enforce that deed restriction, he ended up with a house in his view, whereas a conservation easement is held by a third-party organization like us, and so it's up to us actually to enforce that easement. So we have that responsibility and that financial liability. And so when a landowner donates an easement, it doesn't mean he gives up all his rights. It's based on a plan that I'll explain a little bit later. So what are the financial advantages? A landowner can potentially realize an income tax benefit on their federal and state income taxes, and that's based on the fact that when you restrict a piece of property, most likely you're going to reduce its value on the real estate market. And so that difference in value between what it is worth if you developed it and what it's worth restricted with an easement is available for you to take as a income tax deduction, which can be spread out over a number of years. There's also a conservation easement tax credit that landowners can file for annually through New York State. It doesn't come out of the town's coffers, but you can file annually and get some portion of the property taxes you pay back from New York State. A lot of people say, well, if I do this, am I going to have a tough time selling my property in the future? It is going to limit your buyer pool, but what we found over time is that properties with conservation easements are definitely marketable. Sometimes they're highly marketable, and they're going to sell to like-minded individuals, people who don't really want to develop the land anyway. In terms of how they're enforced, that's one of our biggest responsibilities. It's really, the fun part is really working with landowners to protect their land. The most difficult part is that we take on a perpetual responsibility to oversee these easements in the future. And so we're the ones who are responsible for the cost of enforcement. And so, if somebody wants to consider an easement, the best place to look is a local conservation organization like us, or if you live out of this area, you know, we can certainly put you in touch with somebody. So what is our process? So we initially meet with a landowner and do a site visit. We have to understand what the landowner wants for their future. And then we do a resource analysis where we look at, you know, what does the property have to offer in terms of protection. We also offer a land planning process, which I'll go through a couple of examples. And then we work on the draft easement. If the landowner wants an income tax deduction, then we work with them. We have a list of appraisers who are qualified to do that. We come to consensus on the value. If we're buying an easement, we have to, you know, seek the funding for that. Then once we've gotten to a certain point, we bring it to our board for approval. And then once it's approved by our board, we're all set to close. And it's just like a real estate closing. You sit down and sign lots of paperwork. And then, as I mentioned, you know, the biggest responsibility is then, you know, ours to take on. So in terms of the types of resources that we look at, you know, we look at ag land, you know, are there important farmland soils? We look at the water resources, you know, wetlands, streams, aquifers. The forest land, you know, is it productive forest? Is it intact, you know, part of the larger intact forest? Is it a significant natural resource area? We look at scenic views. We also look at whether it's important for recreational use. And also we look at what are towns, what are our local towns and communities looking for in terms of protection? What are those properties that are really significant to them? Have they been mentioned in their master plans or comprehensive plans? And so going through our resource evaluation, you know, nowadays it's great because we have a lot of resources available through GIS. And so, you know, we can, I was here in the days where we had to do this all by hand, which is it took a lot longer. So we look at the aerial photographs, we look at, you know, what does the land consist of, whether it's forest or open space, forest or agricultural land. We look at what's around the property. And so, you know, in this, you can see the property, you can see there's some protected land, but you can also see it's surrounded by, you know, a lot of forest land, and then the white sort of signifies more open land. And then, as I mentioned, we look at water resources. So, you know, this property, it doesn't have a lot of, oops, sorry, it's on automatic timer. It has some smaller wetlands and some aquifers. You know, you can see there's a lot of steep slopes and very limited amounts of farmland soils. And then we also look at habitat resources. And so, luckily, we work with a number of groups that help with this. And so in terms of working with the landowner, you know, they have to, determine what their goals are for the property, what they, you know, what do they care most about, you know, what do they want to use their land for. They really have to think about the future of the property. Do they have financial considerations? Do they want to retain some rights in the future? You know, what about their family? What about their estate planning? And so, as I mentioned, we go through board approval, and then, you know, again, our easement stewardship is a big part of our work. And, you know, as we accept more and more easements, we're finding that this is a much bigger part of what we're doing and what we promised to do. And so, on an annual basis, these 37,000 acres of property that we protected, we have to monitor. And so, sorry about this. I don't know how to stop the automatic timer. And we want to build strong landowner relationships, and so we work with our landowners, we educate them about their easements, we have to keep good records, and then at the end of the day, if somebody does do something that violates an easement, we have the obligation to enforce that easement. You know, we try to keep good relationships so we don't get into that enforcement issue, but it's there if we have to use it. And so I wanted to run through a couple of examples of how we might go through this process. So here's a 100-acre property. It's mostly wooded. You can see the woodlands. It does have some forest land. It has an existing house on and barns on it. And so we would do our resource assessment. You know, these are prime farm soils, statewide important soils. You can see the back of the property where it's wooded. It has a lot of steep slopes. In terms of water resources, it's got a stream coming through. It doesn't have a lot of wetlands, but it does have an aquifer. But there's also other considerations we have to think about, which is, you know, if the landowner is going to site some future residences on this property, where are they going to go? And so what we would like to look at is to try to encourage houses that aren't built on the crest line, because that impacts everybody else's view. Avoid siting structures right in the middle of the field, because of course that impacts the farmland resource. We want to make sure we keep a good buffer from water resources, because we don't want to pollute or change the biodiversity of that water. And then, you know, as much as we can, we try to avoid forest fragmentation. And so under zoning, this particular property could be divided into 9 lots. Now that doesn't seem like that many maybe, but it's, you know, it's quite a few, and actually because, you know, this back area is pretty steep, that puts some limitations on the land. But you can see that this would have a pretty big impact on this property in terms of its resources. So say the goal of the landowner is to retain, you know, I have my home and I want to retain 2 sites for my children. And so what we would do is work with them, you know, to try to figure out where you put those. And, you know, while in the best of all worlds from a conservation standpoint, it would be best to, you know, put everything towards the road, you know, typically that doesn't always work out. And so what you try to do is, if you're looking at these resource maps over here, you know, you try to, you know, tuck structures into the edges of fields and, you know, right at the edge of the forest, you know, off the most resource intensive areas of the land. And so, and then we try to locate structures in what are called building envelopes. So most of the structures actually go into specific areas of a property, which makes sure that the balance of the land really stays open for preservation purposes. You know, and so the same landowner may say, we might convince them that, well, you know, you have 2 children, but, you know, if you're going to retire, maybe you don't need this house anymore, and so you can retain 2 houses for your children by restricting your property to 2 lots versus 1. But, you know, it's a negotiation, and it's a real balancing act between what you're protecting and ensuring that landowners have the ability to use their property for something worthwhile in the future. So what if you're a town and you're facing a development proposal like this? You know, is there anything that you can do as a town to try to encourage something that might protect some of the resources? And so, you know, a town might say, well, you know, this back area, you know, it would be nice to protect that because it's wooded and it's a part of a larger forested area, and also, you know, it's unlikely it's going to be developed anyway. Or they might look to their zoning and say, look, let's try to, you know, cluster these lots a little bit more intensely so that we can try to keep more of the property intact.
Excuse me, what does HOA stand for?
Oh, sorry, a homeowners association. So often a town, if they have open space, the open space may be owned by a homeowners association. So, so another example, and please disregard the buildings. I'm actually using examples of properties where they're actually not. We try to keep the privacy of our landowners. So this is a mostly open property, but I want to talk about conflicting resources and some of the things that we often have to struggle and deal with. That again, we would go through our resource assessment. Sorry. I'm technologically challenged. Go through a resource assessment, and so we have, you know, in the front of the property, there's some really great ag soils, some statewide important ag soils, but you can see in the back, this is where some pretty intense, you know, ecological systems are going on. And so for this, and then also, excuse me, looking around the property, there's a property here, it's, you know, surrounded by other protected land, and then it's also part of a pretty big intact forest property. And so under zoning, you know, this is what could happen to the property essentially. You know, there are some restrictions back here because of the wet areas, but, you know, it could be pretty intensely developed into 16 lots. And so, you know, working with a landowner, again, you know, say the landowner's goal was, you know, they wanted to reserve the right for 3 lots in the future. You know, we work with them to try to figure out, you know, where you could tuck those in. You know, in the best of all worlds, you wouldn't have to, you know, access from a conservation standpoint the back of the property, but a lot of, you know, again, when you're balancing goals, landowners want some privacy, they want to retain some value in their property. And so you're balancing protecting what you can with, you know, reserving some rights for the landowner for the future. You know, it gets a little easier the less density that a landowner wants. So, you know, if the landowner only wants to reserve one location in the future, then certainly, you know, in terms of resource protection, you're protecting a lot more land. I think the difficulty that we get into both DLC, because we protect a lot of different resources, and other organizations that protect only specific resources, like the Nature Conservancy looks at habitat. American Farmland Trust may look at farmland. So, you know, what we struggle with is there are competing resources. So in this instance, if, you know, the front of the property is highly scenic and visible to the public and contains the prime soils, but the back of the property is the most diverse for habitat purposes. And so this is, you know, from a town's perspective, if they were looking at this, and their goals were really to protect, you know, the habitat areas in the back, you know, they might try to, you know, encourage most of the development to occur in the front of the property so that the back of the property can remain open. On the other hand, you know, if the goals are to protect the prime soils and the views from the main road, you know, they might look at trying to cluster some of the development more towards the back, but also, you know, keeping in mind that there's some pretty significant habitat areas and trying to create as much of a buffer as possible. So a third and final example is another wooded property. And again, you know, looking at the resources for this property, this is a very resource-intense property. You can see there are lots and lots of really high-quality agricultural soils. You know, water resources, you know, it's abundant with wetlands and intact ecosystems. Also has great coverage in terms of aquifers. You know, it's in terms of slopes, you know, it varies. So you've got some steeply sloping areas as well as some less, you know, sort of some really flatter areas over here. And then there are some great habitat resources on this particular property. So the big question is, for us, as if we were asked to work with the landowner on a conservation easement for this property, is, you know, how do we strike a balance between protecting what's most important and what the landowner's goals are. And so this is a resource summary, and this shows that, you know, if you put all those resources on one map, you know, it's like, wow, you scratch your head, where can you site some future development on this property? And, you know, you want to keep in mind, you know, the other uses that a landowner may have, you know, whether it's recreational, forestry, agricultural, you know, residential, future resident, you know, educational, scientific use. So there's lots of different types of uses a landowner may be thinking about. And the other thing that I mentioned a little earlier is that, you know, we also, in our work, we have to remember that landowners want to maintain some value in their property because they might want to sell it in the future, and they have to still pay property taxes on it. So it still has to maintain value so that they have some, you know, options available. And so often when we're working with landowners to site, you know, houses, again, as I mentioned, from a conservation standpoint, this is a road here, and there's a road here. You know, from a conservation standpoint, if you could put all the development along the road, that's good to preserve sort of intact forest habitat. It's not so good necessarily if you're preserving the view from the road. But, you know, a lot of times, you know, you have to also consider that people don't want to live on the road. They want to live in an area where they have, you know, great views, where they have a little privacy. And so, you know, it's trying to strike, as I mentioned, a balance again between what's important to protect and not. So overall, you know, our work is lots of fun. Every single easement that we work on is different. It's great working with landowners because they all have different ideas and different needs. Some landowners know a lot about their property. Other landowners, it's a great educational opportunity for us to work with them to teach them some things about their land. And so we're very lucky to be in a community where, you know, landowners really are interested in ensuring that this area stays as it is. And so, thank you.
And we have time for a couple of questions here. trying to enforce this. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm curious. All these agreements are made, someone puts the house in front of the view. How long does this go on? I mean, do you settle these things quickly, or is it just as much as the person who violated it can afford to pay his attorney?
It's, you know, we haven't been involved in a lot of litigation, but organizations across the country have, and it's really up in the air. You know, it depends upon what judge you get, you know, who your lawyers are. You know, you really want to have a good attorney representing you for one thing, because they really have to know what they're doing. And it's also a lot of times it's educating the judge, because they may not know exactly, you know, the fact that, you know, conservation easements hold a significant part of the environmental conservation law, and there's certain things that organizations can and can't do. You know, judges are always trying to get you to negotiate or to settle, you know, and if you have a real violation, you know, you don't want to settle. You need to enforce that easement. And so these can take certainly years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to settle. Luckily for us, I will say that there is, the Land Trust Alliance is an umbrella organization for land trusts across the country, and they have now established a insurance program, actually, for organizations like us, so we can insure all of our conservation easements. So if we have to go to litigation, all the money doesn't have to come out of our own organization's pocket.
You really educated me on the need to be involved with an organization when you do this.
Great, thank you.
Do you ask easement donors for a stewardship endowment?
Thank you for bringing that up, yes. Of course, because we take on this perpetual responsibility to oversee the easements, we do ask easement donors to give a designated gift to our Stewardship Endowment Fund, and we use the proceeds from that fund to help fund our monitoring on an annual basis, because we do have to go out. We monitor on an annual basis. Most of it we do by aerial overflight, but on a three-year rotating basis, we ground monitor all properties. And so, because that's a cost to us, if the landowner is willing, they make a contribution to us that goes into this restricted fund. That fund could actually also be used to help for enforcement costs. We haven't made it mandatory. We make it optional for the landowner, but we found that if you educate the landowners about it and you sort of explain it's their insurance policy to help ensure that we're around to enforce our easement, a majority of landowners are really willing to make that contribution.
And you mentioned that you work with local towns. Do any of them have a mortgage transfer tax to help support your land trust efforts?
Not in this area. There are a couple of towns that have created funding sources to help, but we haven't done anything like a mortgage transfer tax. Oh, okay,
I'm from Litchfield County, and we have a land trust for every town, so we have over 30 land trusts. I'd be curious as to what you think the primary strength of having a county-wide land trust is, and are there any disadvantages that you see?
You know, I was chairman of the Land Trust Alliance New York Advisory Board, and one of the things that we talked about, and still talk about as I'm still on the board, are the smaller land trusts and the sustainability of those smaller land trusts over time. A lot of them are governed by volunteer boards, which are great if you have a great board and if it's really enthusiastic, but then as boards change over time, they may not be so enthusiastic. Some of the work, you know, may not be getting done, or the stewardship of those properties aren't really insured. And so, you know, so I think that the Land Trust Alliance is encouraging small organizations to merge, essentially, because then you can share resources. You know, we're lucky that we have a professional staff that can do this kind of work. And we can, you know, we have the ability to work in an area as big as Dutchess. We could probably work in an area bigger than Dutchess. So, you know, I think that, you know, it's really a question of sustainability for the smaller land trusts. I'm very familiar with a lot of the Connecticut land trusts. I mean, a lot of them has done, you know, amazing work, you know, using volunteers or very small staff. But the big question, I think, is the sustainability over time, and then the enforcement of these easements. Or, you know, if somebody violates, you know, if they own preserves, you know, what happens to those?
Becky, thanks.
Sure.
And Becky will be around for our panel, so you'll have a chance to ask some more